Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're diving into a genuinely fascinating and honestly highly specific vision of where humanity is headed. Our source material for this analysis is an essay titled Exploring Human Society's Future, and it was written by Xu Feng, the founder of Life Chan Yuan. Now we're going to take a completely neutral, analytical look at his unique worldview. Whether you find his conclusions compelling or just totally radical, mapping out his logic gives us a really interesting lens to look at how technology, governance, and society all interact with one another.
Okay, let's dive right into this. Here's a quick roadmap of how we're going to break down Xu Feng's essay. First, we'll look at what he calls the engine of change, followed by his rather controversial take on technology over morality. Then, we'll examine open versus closed systems. After that, we'll unveil his 8 predictions for humanity, and finally, we'll look at the Life Chan Yuan utopia. Let's get started.
All right, part 1, the engine of change, and how technology essentially rewrites human behavior.
So, Xu Feng's fundamental premise here is that the true driver of human thought isn't philosophy or politics, it is strictly scientific and technological progress. And he lays out this historical timeline to prove it. Back in the 1860s, the steam engine gave us ships and trains, right? That completely altered how people traveled, and even how they dressed. Then the 1870s hit us with electrification, bringing lights and eventually cars and planes. Jump to the 1950s, and atomic energy and early computing shifted our capabilities once again. And today, we've got AI, big data, cloud computing, facial recognition. Xu Feng argues that these recent innovations aren't just convenient new gadgets, they are completely subverting traditional life and forcing a literal revolution in how our brains actually work.
He frames this inevitability with a really practical question right in the text. He asks, who would ride a horse to travel far when airplanes exist? Or, think about it, who writes a physical love letter and walks all the way to the post office when you literally have a smartphone in your pocket? His point here is that adopting these new ways of living isn't really a choice. It's practically forced upon us by technology. It's a completely unavoidable progression.
Which brings us to section 2, technology over morality, and his critique of traditional teachings.
When comparing these two forces, Xu Feng argues that major religions like Christianity, Buddhism, and Islam have been preaching essentially the same moral frameworks for 2,000 years without actually changing how we fundamentally live. He even points to China's moral education campaigns under Mao back in the 1950s and 60s. He argues those didn't bring wealth. Instead, they bred hypocrisy and cunning behavior. Contrast that with science and technology. In his view, while morality kind of stagnates, science is the thing that actually drives revolutionary leaps in our thinking and massively improves our daily living standards.
Moving right along to section 3, open versus closed systems. This is what he considers the second major driver of society.
So, if technology is driver number 1, what's driver number 2? Xu Feng points to systemic institutions. And this brilliantly illustrates his point by directly comparing open versus closed systems, showing how a society's level of freedom correlates directly with its vitality. For open systems, he highlights the United States. In just over 200 years, he notes that its open model has sustained this incredibly vibrant productivity. Conversely, he points to Iran as an example of a closed system. He readily acknowledges the glorious history of the ancient Persian civilization, but he argues that after shifting to a theocratic autocracy under Khomeini, the nation's vitality just declined and became rigid. To really drive this point home, he brings up another pretty stark example, and it revolves around the staggering number, 4 million. Xu Feng writes that Venezuela used to be incredibly wealthy, but after Maduro took absolute power in 2013 and shifted the nation toward a closed, autocratic system, the economy completely collapsed. Out of a population of just 32 million people, this systemic shift created 4 million refugees.
He also briefly throws Zimbabwe into this historical pattern. Once considered the beautiful breadbasket of southern Africa, decades of increasingly conservative and autocratic rule under Mugabe since 1980 led to the complete collapse of its currency in 2009. The big overarching pattern Xu Feng wants us to grasp here is that closed, conservative systems eventually and inevitably stagnate, leaving their people in misery.
All right, now for section 4, 8 predictions for humanity. This is where we map out Xu Feng's radical vision of the future.
Using those foundational rules we just talked about, Xu Feng makes 8 sweeping geopolitical predictions. First, he predicts the inevitable collapse of closed regimes, and he specifically names China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, Venezuela, and Zimbabwe. Why? Because smartphones and the internet make information unblockable. Basically, no firewall can hold back new information forever.
Second, he predicts the absolute dominance of the market economy. He also foresees this profound cultural and religious fusion, a massive explosion of diverse grassroots social organizations, and eventually the fading away of the nation-state concept entirely. That, he says, will lead to the emergence of a global government.
Now, what's really interesting about this concept is captured perfectly in this quote from the essay. "Where there is bread, there is my homeland." Xiufeng predicts that human mobility is going to become so extreme and so frequent that traditional nationalism will just evaporate. The whole idea of a hometown will become nothing more than a lingering sentiment in people's hearts, rather than any sort of geographical or political boundary.
And honestly, this logic leads to what might be one of his most radical social predictions, the complete abolition of marriage. Xiufeng describes traditional marriage as one of the most ignorant phenomena in human society. He predicts the traditional nuclear family will just disappear entirely. Instead, he believes people will rely on collective living and collective emotional dependencies. He actually points specifically to the Konohana family model in Japan as a real-world example of how humans will eventually live and work together in these large, harmonious communities.
Finally, we reach Section 5, the Life Kanyan Utopia and the explosive catalyst for global unity. Up to this point, Xiufeng has mapped out a very tech-driven, system-driven future. But he argues there's one more explosive catalyst required to make this all happen: the environment. He predicts a relentless wave of extreme climate disasters. We're talking unprecedented fires, floods, earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, plagues, and brutal temperature extremes. According to his essay, these aren't just random tragedies. They act as an objective law of nature that will force humanity's hand. In his view, we simply won't have a choice but to band together if we want to survive.
Let's move along and see how this builds into its ultimate formula. Step 1. Severe climate disasters multiply way beyond our control. Step 2. The sheer, unimaginable pressure of survival forces nations to completely dissolve, resulting in total global unity. And Step 3. His own ideology, the Life Chenyuan values, take root globally. What he calls the life oasis model, these collective, harmonious communities we mentioned earlier, blossoms everywhere across the earth. Which brings us to our final thought. Xiufeng, the founder of Life Chenyuan, has mapped out an incredibly bold, almost deterministic path, starting all the way back at the steam engine and heading straight toward a unified, borderless, collective utopia. So, while technology undeniably reshapes our world every single day, will it truly drive us toward this specific unified utopia? Or are we headed for a completely different future entirely? It's a massive, fascinating question to ponder. Thank you so much for joining me on The Explainer today, and keep questioning the world around you.